All right, good morning, good afternoon, whenever you tune in. I am going to talk a little bit in this lecture about Chapter 2 called Terror. And I'm going to start with the concept of the dialectic of trauma. I think she gets to talking about that a little bit farther over into this chapter. See if I can get you a page number. Yeah, page 47, but I'm going to start on page 35 with the top paragraph. Actually, the paragraph that runs over from the page before. On the page before, they were talking, Herman was talking about fragmentation, and then she started talking about the way that Genet, a century ago, started to investigate dissociation. And dissociation is when, as some of the examples show, you feel like you're outside of yourself, you split. A lot of people call it splitting. You've heard of the modern day equivalent of the dissociation, an extreme form of dissociation called dissociated identity. Dissociated identity disorder, or DID, is the new name for multiple personalities and things like that. So it's still happening today, but it started, or the concept of it started with Genet a century ago. And on the next page, page 35, it says in the last sentence, he wrote of the dissolving effect of intense emotion, which incapacitated the synthesizing function of the mind. Well, that word synthesis comes up so many times in this chapter in different forms. Talks about fixating, for example. Let me see if I can get some more of the words that I underlined here. Hang on. Ramble, right? Integration, that oscillating rhythm. All right, so I go to page 47, and just to get you into this moment, into this idea of the dialectic of trauma, a dialectic is basically, well, the best way to explain it is really in the form of writing, the way that we've all been taught to write research papers, for example. In a research paper, our job is to first assert the thesis. Anytime you write a paper, everybody says, what's the first thing you do? You tell your thesis, right? And this is stereotype. This is not the way that any of us actually write, but in the stereotype, you have your thesis. And the thing that's opposite of the thesis is the antithesis, or the antithesis. Some people call that the counter-argument. So you state your argument, you state your counter-argument, and in the end, your goal is to sort of try to bring those together in some way, to make sense of the argument and the counter, to make sense of the thesis and the antithesis together. And that making sense, or that integration, that reintegration of the thesis and the antithesis, is called the synthesis. And as you probably remember from 1980s pop techno music, to synthesize is to bring lots of sounds together into a cohesive sort of melody, or into something that we can understand. And so you kind of already get the idea if you think about the way that we write with thesis, antithesis, and then synthesis. Well, that's exactly the way that Herman is describing trauma, and she calls it a dialectic of trauma. And she outlines basically a few things that get into that oscillating rhythm between the thesis and the antithesis. She says they go between the extremes of the numbing symptoms and hyperarousal, for example. So on the one side, their thesis might be numbness, and the antithesis might be hyperarousal. So they constantly oscillate between those two, kind of banging back and forth against the wall of those two extremes, and that is what she's calling the dialectic of trauma. But more than that, as we've been sort of discussing on the discussion boards, and as I've been bringing up with these poems that I've been posting, is the notion of temporality, right? So temporality is just a big word for time, and as far back as humans were cognitively thinking, as far back as humans were sentient, one of the ways that people have made sense of the world is to organize it by time. And so we move in a linear motion. We go from past to present. And when our bodies and our minds are able to do that, to go from past to present, then we have synchrony. Everything makes sense. Everything is synchronized. Everything is thesis-driven, you might even say. Everything is already synthesized for us. We don't have to try to understand the past as it relates to the present, or the future as it might relate to the past, because everything's kind of smooth sailing in one forward trajectory in time. But when you are a traumatized person and you have these desires, as she points out in the chapter on terror, to reenact, right, to go back and to make sense of the past in the present, then you have anachrony. And anachrony is the opposite of synchrony, or everything being as it should be. When you have anachrony, you've got a new dialectic set up, and that's the dialectic of past and present. So whereas we want to sort of stay here, everybody, the new motto is, and the new mantra in health today is, stay present, be in the now. right? Everybody wants to be here, but when you're a traumatized person and you haven't yet integrated or synthesized your past with your present, then you've set up the two extremes of your dialectic, the past and the present, and you become the person who oscillates between those. So as you're going back and forth between those, sometimes the present feels like the past, sometimes the past feels like the present. Neither of those, as she pointed out in her chapter, feels like the future, because you don't have much of a way of looking at the future if you're constantly oscillating between the dialectic of the past and the present. And so if you see the dialectic of the past and the present as the thesis and the antithesis, the job here, the goal here, the ultimate goal of all trauma healing is, of course, to synthesize, to bring the two together, to recognize, to acknowledge, to remember that the person who experienced the past trauma is the exact same person that you are, for example, today. So I'm talking, I guess, more directly to those people who have confessed to having become traumatized, but also to the wives of the soldiers out there, and the mothers to the soldiers, right, and the sisters and the brothers, and then also to the brothers and the sisters and fathers and even friends of women who have been raped or sexually assaulted. In order to make any type of sense of the stories of trauma, we have to first recognize that they're always working in these multiple dialectics, right? So you're listening to a trauma narrative, you're listening to someone's trauma story, you're listening to a girl who got raped last week, right? And she is already submerged in the center or oscillating within these multiple dialectics. So her story might come out as fragments of the past and the present. It might come out as fragments of feeling numb and then feeling too much emotion. It might come out as fragments of her having been inside of her body and then her having been standing on the corner of the room as an observer, as the woman talks about in Herman's chapter when she talks about dissociating. So you have to recognize that as we read, for example, Dorothy Allison's narrative, or any of the poems that we read this semester, or as women and men come forward and confess of their own traumatized stories, you can almost expect certain sort of qualities or motifs to be evident in these trauma narratives, and some of them are the fragmentation, the oscillation between past and present, the inability to really see the future, or the unwillingness to see the future. You get a very clear sense of the past and the present, but there's not a real forward-looking motion going on in these narratives. You get a sense of going from being inside of the situation to the trauma survivor actually him or herself becoming a witness for themselves. And so it becomes really, really complicated the more that we start to think about reading these narratives and hearing these people's narratives, because they are unstable. They have no real present to ground themselves in, because the present is always being invaded and sort of eaten away at by the past. So these dialectics, it's really important to continue to understand those and to continue to keep your eye out for those. People who are studying rapeability, you've got the dialectic of rapeable and unrapeable to contend with. And people oscillate back and forth between those two things constantly in the courtrooms, in families. Sometimes families can't even admit that their daughter, like the father can't admit that the daughter has been raped. And so in his mind, he's going through the dialectic. Is my daughter rapeable or is she unrapeable? And maybe he's already made one decision. She's definitely unrapeable. I'm never going to believe it. And in that case, isn't she sort of performing the same move that Freud made when he said, there's no way that that all of these women could have been sexually abused as children. There's just no way. It can't be true. It absolutely must not be true. And so in a lot of ways, people who deny that trauma exists, for example, and if you haven't met somebody yet, you will, people who deny that there is such a thing as PTSD, they're sort of pushing all of those atrocities just off to the side of their mind and saying there's no way that that can exist. I cannot live in a world where that exists. So they have, instead of embracing the thesis, which is, yeah, it actually happens, it's happening right now, and it will continue to happen. Instead of embracing that thesis, they've gone all the way to the other side and embraced the antithesis of their dialectic, and they're on that road. Bad things don't happen to good people. There's no way that my daughter could have been raped. You're not experiencing PTSD because it doesn't exist, because the war, because the trauma that caused it could not have existed. So those people have yet to synthesize, and in a way are experiencing their own vicarious or witnessing trauma. And it's our job to sort of show them that they too are experiencing the after effects and the post part of the trauma alongside of the soldiers who are coming home from war, and the little girls and boys who have grown up after having been sexually abused as children, and the women who were raped last week or last year or repeatedly, or who are being raped continually by their spouses. We're all implicated in this dialectic. all of us are having a really hard time imagining a positive future because of all of the crazy